The witch's love. The scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs as I moved silently through the forest, the sunlight filtering through the thick canopy above. Towering trees with gnarled trunks stood like ancient sentinels, their branches interwoven to create a natural cathedral. Moss carpeted the ground, softening my steps, while shafts of golden light pierced through the emerald canopy, illuminating patches of wildflowers in hues of violet and yellow. Every leaf, every stone, whispered its secrets to me, carrying the timeless song of life and renewal. But today, the whispers carried unease. Something was wrong. The cheerful birdsong and playful rustling of deer in the underbrush belied the tension I felt deep within. My steps quickened, following the faint pulse of magic that told me where the disturbance lay. The path wound through towering trees draped in lichen and past a bubbling brook that mirrored the golden sunlight. The air grew heavier as I approached, carrying a faint scent of smoke mingled with sap. When I finally reached the source, I stopped. A cabin, human-built, nestled among the trees as though it had always been there. Its wooden walls were weathered, blending seamlessly with the surrounding greenery, as if the forest had begrudgingly accepted its presence. But I knew better. This was new. I moved closer, keeping to the shadows. The cabin was simple, its wooden walls blending with the forest around it. It smelled of sap and fresh-cut timber, not the acrid tang of industry I had come to associate with humans. The faint sound of movement inside caught my attention, and then I saw him. A man stepped out onto the porch, his arms cradling an injured fox. My heart leaped and anger flared as I jumped to conclusions. Had he hunted this creature? Had he dared harm one of my own? But as I crouched in the shadows, ready to strike, his actions stopped me. He gently laid the fox down on a bench and began inspecting its paw with a tenderness that caught me off guard. There, he murmured, his voice low and soothing. We'll get you fixed up. His hair, the color of autumn leaves, caught the fading sunlight, and his emerald green eyes glimmered with genuine concern. The fox whimpered, and he whispered soft reassurances, his hands moving deftly as he prepared a poultice. I froze. He wasn't like the other humans I'd encountered, those who trampled through my forest with no regard for its life. His touch was gentle, his movements deliberate. I watched as he applied a poultice to the fox's wound, his hands steady but kind. When the fox whimpered, he murmured soft reassurances, his voice like a balm. My heart fluttered. Curiosity warred with caution. I had seen kind faces before, only to be met with betrayal. But this man, Lucas, I heard him call himself when he spoke to a strange device on his wrist, was different. Day after day, I watched him from the shadows, marveling at the way he moved through the forest as though it were his home. He didn't just care for the animals, he spent hours mending broken branches, clearing debris from the forest floor, and carving small markers to guide lost travelers back to the main trails. I once saw him build a tiny shelter from fallen logs for a family of shivering rabbits during a storm, his hands deft and purposeful. He paused often to sketch the wildflowers and mushrooms he encountered, treating each discovery like a precious treasure. Lucas whispered to the trees as though they could hear him, his voice low and reverent. And perhaps they could, for they seemed to lean toward him, their leaves rustling as though in greeting. At dawn, I caught glimpses of him kneeling by the brook, his hands cupping the clear water as he murmured words of gratitude to the forest. At dusk, he would light a small smokeless fire and sit with his notebook, documenting his thoughts and the lessons he had learned from the day. There was a quiet determination in his every action, as though he carried the weight of the forest's well-being on his shoulders. And perhaps he did. Despite myself, I was captivated by his unyielding kindness and the magic that seemed to radiate from him in subtle, unspoken ways. I told myself I was only observing him to ensure he meant no harm, but as days turned into weeks, I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain. The way he smiled when the birds perched on his shoulder, his soft laughter when the squirrels darted around his feet, and the quiet determination in his eyes as he worked, all of it wove a spell around me. There was a grace in his movements, a careful reverence for every creature and every blade of grass he encountered. Despite myself, I was captivated. My gaze lingered too long on the curve of his jaw, the way the sunlight caught the copper strands in his hair. A warmth began to unfurl in my chest whenever I watched him, a yearning I hadn't felt in centuries. It was more than admiration, it was desire, the ache of wanting to understand him, to feel his kindness directed at me. His very presence seemed to fill the forest with a deeper magic, one that I couldn't name but felt all the same. My thoughts began to betray me, imagining his hand brushing against mine or his voice murmuring my name as if it belonged to him. I couldn't deny it any longer. I was enchanted, and it was not by magic but by the man himself. It was inevitable, I suppose, that our paths would cross. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest bathed in golden light, I found myself drawn too close, unable to resist his presence any longer. My own thoughts betrayed me, and in a moment of distraction, my concealment spell slipped from my grasp like a breath carried away by the wind. Lucas looked up, his sharp gaze meeting mine. His eyes widened, not in fear but in wonder, and a slow, warm smile spread across his face.
"Well, hello there,"
he said, his voice as gentle and strong as ever.
"I was wondering when you'd show yourself."
I froze, my heart pounding. How had he known I was there? Humans weren't supposed to see through my magic. But Lucas didn't seem afraid. If anything, he seemed delighted.
"You're her, aren't you?
He continued, taking a cautious step closer.
The guardian of the forest."
I am no one's guardian, I replied sharply, though my voice lacked the conviction I intended. This forest belongs to itself. He smiled again, a slow, genuine thing that made my heart flutter against my will.
"Fair enough, but you've been watching me, haven't you?"
I hesitated. I've been ensuring you're not a threat.
"And?"
His gaze was steady, his eyes searching mine. And you're not, I admitted grudgingly. Lucas's smile widened, and he held out a hand as though to shake mine.
"I'm Lucas."
I stared at his hand, then at him. I know, he chuckled, lowering his hand.
"Right. Of course you do."
Despite my wariness, I found myself lingering. Lucas spoke easily, his words light and unassuming, carrying the kind of warmth that made me feel, for the first time in centuries, that I wasn't alone. He told me about the forest as he saw it, painting vivid pictures of the places he'd discovered. A hidden grove of orchids blooming in the shadows, a rocky outcrop where the hawks nested, a moss-covered log where the frogs croaked their evening songs. His voice was filled with wonder as he described each moment, each treasure he'd stumbled upon.
"You must have seen it all.
He said once, his green eyes bright with curiosity.
But every time I find something new, I can't help but think, this place holds infinite surprises."
I couldn't stop the small smile that tugged at my lips. Even for me, the forest is never static. It's always changing.
"Like you?"
He replied softly, his gaze locking onto mine. The intensity of his words startled me, and I looked away, unsure of how to respond. He asked nothing of me, demanded nothing, yet his presence invited a closeness I wasn't sure I knew how to give.
"You don't need to say anything,"
he said gently, sensing my hesitation.
"I just like sharing these moments with you."
It was disarming, and despite myself, I stayed. Over the next few days, I found myself drawn to him more and more. We began to meet at the edges of clearings, where he'd sketch wildflowers in his notebook or tend to an injured bird. Slowly, I let my guard down, revealing bits of myself I'd kept hidden for centuries. Lucas listened without judgment, his curiosity tempered by respect. One evening, as we sat beneath an ancient oak, Lucas turned to me.
"Why do you guard this forest so fiercely?"
I hesitated. It is my home, my duty.
"But it's more than that, isn't it?"
He pressed gently. I looked away, the weight of old wounds pressing down on me, my eyes filled up. Humans have not always been kind to this place, to me. Lucas's expression softened.
"I'm sorry for that, but not all humans are the same."
I've heard that before, I said bitterly. He reached out, his hand hovering just above mine.
"I'm not asking you to trust me.
He said quietly.
Just don't push me away."
For a long moment I stared at his hand, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Trust did not come easily to me, not after centuries of solitude and betrayal. But there was something in the way he waited, patient, steady, his green eyes holding mine without a hint of expectation or demand. Slowly, almost against my will, I reached out. When my fingers touched his, warmth blossomed through me like the first rays of dawn breaking through the forest canopy. His hand was rough, calloused from his work, but it held mine with such gentleness that it sent a shiver through me. My breath caught, and for a moment it felt as though the entire forest stilled, holding its breath alongside me. He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling in that disarming way of his. I'm glad you stayed, he said softly, his voice resonating like the gentle rustle of leaves. My heart fluttered, the walls I had so carefully built around myself trembling in the wake of his sincerity. In that moment, I felt both fragile and fierce, as though I had finally found a place where I could belong. Over time, we grew closer. Lucas's presence became a comfort, his laughter a melody that echoed through the forest. Together, we mended broken trails and planted new life. He taught me to see the beauty in small, fleeting moments, and I showed him the magic hidden in the forest's depths. One evening, as fireflies danced around us and the forest hummed with life, Lucas turned to me.
You've given so much to this place, but what about you? What do you want?
The question took me by surprise. No one had ever asked me that before. I don't know, I admitted. I've never thought about it. Lucas's gaze was steady.
Then think about it. You deserve to be happy too.
His words stayed with me long after he'd gone, echoing in my mind like the wind through the trees. For centuries, I'd lived for the forest, for the creatures within it, pouring every ounce of my being into its protection. But now, for the first time, I began to wonder if there could be more. A life not just of duty, but of connection. The next evening, as twilight wrapped the forest in its lavender haze, Lucas and I stood beneath the sprawling limbs of an ancient oak. The air between us was electric, charged with unspoken words and unacknowledged desires. He stepped closer, his gaze searching mine, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe.
I don't want to push you,
he said softly, his voice a balm to the doubts that lingered in my chest.
but I need you to know I'm here. For you. For whatever you choose.
I felt the walls I had so carefully built over centuries begin to crumble. A yearning I had buried deep within me surged to the surface, raw and undeniable. I reached out, my fingertips brushing his cheek, marveling at the warmth of his skin. He leaned into my touch, his eyes fluttering closed for a moment as though savoring it. When he opened them again, his emerald gaze burned with an intensity that made my heart stutter.
You're everything I never thought I'd find.
He murmured.
Wild, fierce, beautiful.
Before I could overthink, before fear could creep in and steal this moment, I tilted my head and closed the distance between us. Our lips met, and the world seemed to stop. His kiss was gentle yet insistent, like the first drops of rain after a long drought, awakening something within me that had lain dormant for too long. The forest around us seemed to respond, the rustling leaves and the song of crickets swelling in harmony with the rhythm of my pounding heart. His hand slid to my waist, grounding me even as I felt like I might float away. The taste of him was intoxicating, a heady mix of warmth and something unnameable, something entirely Lucas. When we finally parted, his forehead rested against mine and we stood there, breathless and wrapped in each other's presence.
That
He said with a soft chuckle.
was worth the wait.
I couldn't help but smile, my fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I didn't know it was possible to feel this way.
Then let me show you.
In that moment, surrounded by the forest I'd always called home, I realized I'd found something more. Someone who could make it feel whole in ways I never imagined. Together, we became the guardians of the forest, our love a bridge between two worlds. And though the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. With Lucas by my side, I was no longer alone.